video you are about to see commemorates Elliott Carter's 6th visit to Toronto as a guest of New Music Concerts. We are delighted to have this opportunity to celebrate his 100th anniversary. In all the years I've known Elliott, not once has he complained about the metric relationship between one tempo and the other one. He's just concerned, as all great musicians are, really with color, dynamics, and the meaning. And so all these aspects are more important to him than all of these other things. And my greatest fears disappeared with that first visit. Now, Elliott is very, very particular about dynamics. I was sitting at home one night having supper, and the phone rang, and it was Elliott Carter phoning from New York, and he said, "You know, Bob, in that 45th bar where I have that piano E, maybe it would be better to make it a mezzo piano." And I thought, good heavens. This is like 6 weeks after the piece was composed, and he's still fine-tuning and being concerned with such tiny details as a mezzo piano or a piano on a staccato E. This is the kind of man he is, extremely concerned with the finest things, and he knows the instruments very well. The challenges of performing Carter is the same as performing all great composers, as one needs to find exactly the right color, dynamic and shaping of the phrase for the performance to succeed. Also, if you begin a piece too fast or too slow, too loud or too soft, it is difficult to change it. It's difficult to correct it because everything is related to everything else in his music, and how the piece begins really determines how it ends.
Anything else?
No, it's beautiful.
For many years, flute players have been anxious to have a work from Elliott Carter for their instrument. His writing style needs counterpoint. It needs a lot of activity, and until that time, his only pieces for chamber music have involved a lot of counterpoint. Well, I was in Europe teaching, where I have been for the last few years, and he phoned me up and asked if I'd like to join them for supper, which I did. We talked again about possibility of writing a piece for flute, and he was humming and hawing, and I explained to him, well, why don't you write the last movement for the Bach solo sonata? I was back in Toronto 3 weeks later, and the phone rang, and Elliott said, well, it's just about done. He named it Scrivo Invento, which was the name of one of Petrarch's many sonnets. And then a few days after the premiere, we took him for a drive to Fontaine de Vaucluse, where the poet actually lived. My daughter Diane said, look, Elliott, my father played the premiere of your piece on Petrarch's birthday. Just by chance, total chance, the premiere of the piece was on his birthday.
Question about dialogues. How deeply and at what level of detail did the metaphor of conversation guide the composition of the piece?
Professionals are musicians. They've learned music just as you might have learned French or Japanese. There's always a conversation between composers and musicians just because of this professional training. It's just a matter of familiarity, you know. I used to speak Greek, but I've forgotten it now, but I don't forget music.
You do read a lot, and you have a great knowledge of literature. And you have many titles and many pieces which relate to literature. And how does the influence of these books, these poems, and so on, actually transmit into your creative process?
I think in every case, it's every one of the things you might ask me about in this list of pieces is done in a different way. The concerto for orchestra, for instance, was had a relationship with the French poem "Winds" of Saint Jean Perse. Then I thought, well, you know, this is so much like what I'm writing. I would shape the piece a little bit as the poem goes, but the idea for the piece was there before the poem. I wrote a piece for Oliver Nussin called OK, which of course is his capital, his what he called acronym, OC, OK, I mean. And I found an article by Schoenberg about OK and why it's called OK, and that is in French, OK. And the story is the people, the French town ran out to see whether their people were coming home on the boats, and when they did, they yelled OK, OK.
What are you reading at the moment?
Oh, well, I'm reading Rabelais. I never have before, and I find it extremely surprising and entertaining.
In Old French?
Well, I have Old French on one side, New French on the other.
It's translated from Old French to New French.
Yeah, I can read the Old French, but it's they're especially rather indecent words. They're not very clear to me.
And you know them in the New French?
More or less. For instance, now the other one, the recent one, the piano piece I wrote for Peter Serkin is called Intermittences. And in this case, I've been reading Marcel Proust, and there's a chapter called Intermittences of the Heart. And it is all about his going somewhere and going to the beach after his grandmother had died, who had gone with him the previous time, and he remembers all the different things that they did and said to each other, and how kind she was. All the memory, as it is in his Bruce, all of this comes up when he starts to button his shoe. In those days, they button shoes, and the grandmother used to help him button his shoe, and he suddenly remembered this wonderful paragraph, many pages, describing how she had dealt with him when he was younger and how she helped him. And I thought that was an interesting idea. Now, I don't think my piece actually buttons the shoe, but it sort of suggests things of this sort a little bit.
Both of these pieces, when we began to rehearse them, I thought, what an unusual form, especially Mosaic as a piece of music, very unusual form, and I wondered where it came from. It wasn't stream of consciousness, I don't think.
Well,
and it's balanced by the long harp solo. You have to allow
the composer some freedom, you know.
Yeah, to create, you mean freedom to create without restrictions.
Yeah, I can't tell you. I don't know why I wrote it that way exactly. There was no preconceived form. There was obviously, as you listen and you now that you make me think about it, it was obviously I was thinking that there would be sections in which the harp would play alone, play rather elaborately alone, and I thought, well, maybe those poor other people ought to do something too.
That's it.
That's part of the way I think.
One of the things people.
I hate to have all those musicians sitting around not doing anything, and I like to give them something that will amuse them or interest them to play.
Yes,
and that's in my head too, you know, like many other nutty things.
Mosaic seems to be a work of naturalist abstraction. Was there, in fact, a direction from nature in this piece?
In the course of writing a piece of music, I'm interested in the music a great deal. I'm not interested in where it came from. I have all sorts of experiences about nature, of course, and I have all sorts of urban experiences, and I suppose they all get mixed up together, and finally a piece comes out. That's all I can say.
Pierre Boulez advocated against the primacy of the score, that it isn't absolute. You seem to disagree. How much of the music is open to interpretation? How much freedom should the conductor have?
It's a very interesting question. After all, for those of us who've gone to many concerts, as I used to, you hear, let's say, a ballade of Chopin played by 5 different pianists, and my God, they're very different, and yet it's all the same piece. And I think that the actual composition is not unlike a play. It's like let's say, a performance of Hamlet. The character of Hamlet is acted maybe in 20 different ways, and yet it's always Hamlet. And it seems to me that the score is always sort of is a kind of message to a performer about certain aspects of the intention of the composer and the imagination of the composer, but in the end, the performer himself has to add his imagination to it. Now, you ask me about freedom. By God, I like them to play my pieces pretty clearly, pretty much as they're written. But I do think that even so, it's possible to have it interpreted in many different ways.
He was questioning how a score should be notated.
Each of the instruments has his own kind of
Dynamic
speciality. I mean, the clarinet plays a high note, and it's a good deal more piercing, especially in the very highest register, than a flute or piccolo. And yet you write the piccolo with the same. You write the dynamics of both of them the same, which I do, because I expect the performer to understand that. Now, Mahler went through a lot of his scores and fixed it up so that the horn is playing pianissimo while the violin is playing forte, in order to make it balance in some way.
But then the person that looks at the score could have a totally false impression of the
Exactly.
piece.
That's why I don't do it.
That's why I don't think Boulez was
I think,
exactly on
it
the
seems
target
you
there.
write what the general character is. And there, in fact, there are certain early scores of Honegger in which he wrote the dynamics above the score, saying forte, and then everybody had to find out what forte meant.
Some instruments, when they try to play quietly, are quite loud.
Yeah.
Bass trombone, for example. And if the composer takes that into consideration, as Stravinsky did in some scores also, then when a musician looks at the score, or a conductor, you really don't know what was intended. Because if he writes a piccolo triple piano, and then he writes let's pick an instrument, or an English horn triple 40, in order that they balance, you don't really know what it was supposed to be. So in the end, it's better to write what you want to hear and let the players adjust. That's what you say,
You want
right?
the total effect that you want to hear.
You want to be able to look at a score and know what you're supposed to hear, and then you make the adjustments after that.
And then, of course,
right?
the basic story is that all those old classics of Brahms and the rest was no concern for this. He just writes forte and piano and the rest of it, and it's up to the performers, and they've all, by this time, learned just whether they should play some of the loud parts softly, for instance.
Yeah. How do dialogues relate to your piano concerto? I can hear allusions in the opening Cor Anglais solo.
The basic problem, of course, is that the piano concerto is for large orchestra and piano. It was commissioned by the Ford Foundation in America. Dialogues was written for a small group. It was written for the instruments that are played here tonight, for pairs of strings and woodwinds. And it presented an entirely different acoustical problem, which was part of the whole idea of dealing with this. So I tried to treat the piano more or less as a chamber music instrument rather than as a big or a sort of rhetorical instrument as you would do in a piano concerto.
What usually starts you on a composition? How do you start? With a theme, a key instrument, or something else? What usually
I
starts
usually
you?
start a composition while I'm walking on the street. I mean, a certain kind of texture will come to my mind, how I'd like to have a group of instruments sound together, for instance. Or another time, it's a linear thing, but very rarely do I start with what you might call a theme. I may extend some small idea that I've had into quite a long line, which is a theme, but then very often I don't do that. My compositions, as you've heard, a lot of them are just fragments of themes. They're not actually, the pieces aren't thought that way anymore. I don't think that way. I just think of how, I think differently each time.
Could you tell us about your new opera to be performed at Tanglewood?
It involves, the opera is actually the aftermath of an automobile accident. It starts with that. And the people all revive and they're kind of dizzy. And there's one woman who had just given a concert the night before, and she tries to remember what she was singing. And the entire opera is her aria. And all the other things, she is accompanying almost all the other things and everything else that people are singing. She's singing always, a few notes here and there throughout, and then the opera ends with her singing High C. And I thought that was quite an idea. I think it's quite sort of fun. I'm writing a horn concerto for the Boston Symphony. That's what's next.
And who will play it? Do you
What?
know? And
The man who's
in the first horn in the
Jamie Somerville.
Well, he's Canadian. We know him very well. Mosaic is dedicated to Carlos Salcedo.
Carlos Salcedo was of course, a harpist. And he was part of a group who started contemporary music, a small contemporary music society in New York after the First World War. I knew very well. He developed many different ways of playing the harp, of many of which you hear in this harp piece. I feel I'd like to write pieces for the people that I knew that meant something to me long ago.
Do you actually compose every day?
If some problem comes up like if we need new window shades, for instance, I won't think of it. Pull them down and they fall. But I'm writing my piece.
You don't do anything about it anymore.
But it's and that's not bad. That's not good. In the end, you have a lot of trouble with situations like that.
Mosaic. How long would you have worked on that piece? Can you recall?
That took less time than many pieces. I can't tell you why.
Well, because you're concentrating on the harp, probably.
The harp was, the hardest instrument to write for that I write for is the guitar. You never know how far, where they can put their fingers. I mean, and they don't know what the stretches are. The harp is the next to the hardest. And if you try to keep the lady from pedaling on every single note in the piece, which I...
You did a very bad job, I have to tell you.
Well, it's almost as if she were driving a car. Now, look, I think she did very well. And
She did very well. Bravo.
We don't single out her alone, but the pianist is extraordinary, too.
David can play everything.
And he has that fast passage
in
where it all
the middle.
noodles around, and my God, that's hard. It's like a tongue twister. No note comes back in the right place. It all goes very fast. And I've wrote it so that the pianist could not beat time with it.